Well, I mean, for me it was. I know that he was working so hard because he was doing Jack and Jill, obviously. So it was a lot of time. But
After keeping quiet for years, Katie Holmes is starting to open up a little more about one of the most talked about chapters of her life. You probably remember how she seemed to be everywhere in the mid-2000s, smiling on red carpets, attending big premieres, and playing the role of Hollywood's picture-perfect wife. But behind that public image, things weren't nearly as simple as they looked from the outside. Back in 2012, she shocked just about everyone when she filed for divorce from Tom Cruise. Now, more than 10 years later, Holmes is 46, and she's ready to talk. And believe me, what she's revealing isn't just juicy gossip. It's going to make you reevaluate every single headline you ever casually scrolled past. Seriously, try not to gasp. The fairy tale that wasn't. Looking back, the whole thing really did unfold like a movie plot. One day, Katie Holmes was still remembered mostly as the girl next door from Dawson's Creek. And then suddenly, she was in a headline-making romance with Tom Cruise, one of the most famous actors in the world. Their relationship took off quickly, with grand gestures that sounded almost scripted. Motorcycles sent to her film set, roses arriving at her family's doorstep, and trips on his private jet. It was a whirlwind, and people couldn't get enough. Tabloids and entertainment magazines sold out as fans followed every detail of what seemed like a picture-perfect Hollywood love story. But behind the fairy tale image, there were elements that gave people pause. Holmes had only recently ended an engagement with actor Chris Klein, and within weeks, she was photographed at Tom's side. The timing led to a lot of speculation about whether this was a genuine romance or something orchestrated. And then came that infamous moment on Oprah's couch in 2005, where Tom's very public declaration of love became an instant cultural reference point. For some, it was proof of how passionate he was. For others, it raised questions about whether the whole thing was more performance than reality. Just a month after going public, Cruise proposed in Paris, at the Eiffel Tower, no less. Not long after, Holmes announced she was studying Scientology, which was a sharp departure from her Catholic upbringing in Toledo, Ohio. Friends and family were reportedly shocked by the sudden change, and it created real tension in her personal life. For Holmes, who had once described herself as a Midwestern girl with traditional values, this shift must have been a huge adjustment. At first, she described it as an exciting adventure, something new and different, but over time, the world she entered proved far more complicated than she, or anyone else on the outside, might have expected. What began as a whirlwind romance quickly became a global spectacle, with every choice scrutinized and every smile photographed. And while to the public, it all looked like a fairy tale, for Holmes, it was the beginning of a chapter that would eventually test her independence and reshape her future. Scientology 101, Holmes Edition. Imagine being in your 20s, newly in love, and suddenly finding yourself introduced to an entirely new way of life, one that comes with its own rules, routines, and expectations. For Katie Holmes, that introduction came through Scientology, the church Tom Cruise had been closely associated with for decades. Former Scientologists have spoken about programs like Life Repair, which are designed to provide counseling and structure, but in practice, many describe them as intense and sometimes overwhelming. For Holmes, it reportedly felt less like gentle guidance and more like a rigid blueprint for how she was expected to live. From the big decisions about family down to the smallest details of daily life. The church also assigned her what they called a handler, essentially someone who was with her almost constantly to guide and monitor her involvement. That meant her schedule, her conversations, even casual choices like what book she read or who she kept in touch with were all closely observed. Privacy, something most of us take for granted, became a rare thing. For Tom, who had spoken openly about how Scientology had helped him through difficult times, including his divorce from Nicole Kidman, this structure felt reassuring. He believed it could strengthen their marriage and their future together. Katie, at least for a while, tried to share in that belief. Love often makes people overlook or rationalize things they might otherwise question. And in the beginning, she described the whole experience as an adventure. But over time, the weight of constant supervision and the strict boundaries around her independence began to wear on her. Her family, who had raised her in the Catholic tradition in Ohio, were deeply unsettled by how quickly she had immersed herself in Scientology, and they worried about the growing distance between her new world and the one she came from. According to reports from those close to the situation, it began to feel less like a supportive partnership and more like a system of control, one where nearly every choice was filtered through the expectations of the church. And while the outside world still saw glamorous photos of a star couple, inside, Holmes was already beginning to ask herself difficult questions about what her future might look like if she ever decided she wanted something different. The turning point. By 2010, Katie Holmes was juggling two very different worlds. On one hand, she was raising Suri, a bright and precocious 4-year-old who was already asking the kinds of questions children of celebrities inevitably face, like why people with cameras seem to follow her even on the way to dance class. On the other, Holmes was still managing the complex reality of her marriage and its ties to Scientology. While she was filming The Kennedys in Toronto, Holmes reportedly became uneasy when she noticed the same unfamiliar car parked near her hotel several nights in a row. Living in the public eye meant she was accustomed to paparazzi, but this felt different, and it fueled her growing sense that she and her daughter were under more than ordinary scrutiny. Around this time, Holmes began learning more about aspects of Scientology that troubled her, especially when it came to children. The church's Sea Organization, often referred to as the Sea Org, has long been controversial, with accounts from former members describing its strict rules and the demanding expectations placed on young recruits. Reports about the Rehabilitation Project Force, a disciplinary program within the church, further heightened her concern. For a mother already wary of her daughter's exposure to the church, the possibility that Suri might one day be drawn into that system was alarming. Friends close to Holmes have said that this was when her priorities shifted decisively. She began researching her legal options, focusing not just on protecting herself, but on ensuring she would retain custody of Suri if the marriage ended. Religious upbringing can sometimes be raised in custody disputes, and though courts are typically reluctant to intervene directly in matters of faith, Holmes understood that Tom's deep commitment to Scientology could become a significant factor. These realizations didn't lead to immediate action, but they planted the seeds of a plan. What had once been a whirlwind romance was now an environment she felt she needed to carefully, quietly navigate her way out of, for her own peace of mind and for her daughter's future. Building the exit strategy. By the summer of 2012, Holmes knew she had to make her move carefully. People close to her have said she became increasingly cautious about who she trusted, especially when it came to her professional team. She quietly shifted her representation, surrounding herself with advisors who weren't connected to Scientology and who could help her plan privately. One of her most important decisions was to hire a new set of lawyers in New York, well outside the circle of Hollywood, which gave her both distance and discretion. Communication was a key concern. Media outlets later reported that she used disposable cell phones, basic devices purchased under the radar, to keep her conversations with her legal team secure and out of reach from anyone who might pass information along. It was a simple but effective way of keeping her intentions hidden until she was ready to act. Around this same time, she reportedly reached out to people who had navigated similar situations before, including Nicole Kidman, who had her own highly publicized divorce from Cruise a decade earlier. The advice was straightforward: stay strong, be careful, and above all, protect your child. Holmes also began making quiet preparations in New York City, where she had long expressed a desire to base herself and raise Suri. She and her team scouted a separate apartment, one that could give her both privacy and a sense of safety while she put her legal strategy in place. For weeks, she managed to maintain her normal public routines, taking Suri out for ice cream, visiting parks, showing up for reshoots, while privately rehearsing the steps she would take when the time came. The attention to detail was remarkable, not because she wanted to dramatize her life, but because she understood the stakes. She knew she had to leave in a way that was both decisive and impossible to undo. By the time she finally filed for divorce in June 2012, her plan was already weeks in motion. Holmes had retained full custody of Suri almost immediately, a sign of how thoroughly she and her lawyers had prepared. To the outside world, the news seemed to explode overnight, but for Holmes, the groundwork had been carefully laid over months of quiet, methodical planning. The call that changed everything. By June 2012, Katie Holmes's plan was ready. She had quietly retained a team of New York lawyers, secured housing, and taken careful steps to ensure her next move would remain hidden until the very last moment. Friends and colleagues later recalled how composed she seemed on the outside, even as she worked behind the scenes to prepare for one of the most closely watched divorces in Hollywood history. When Holmes finally filed for divorce on June 29th, she did so in New York rather than California, a strategic choice that legal experts noted gave her a stronger position on custody. Filing in Manhattan allowed her to request sole custody of Suri, under state laws that were often considered more favorable to primary caregivers. It also kept the process somewhat insulated from the Hollywood glare, at least in its earliest stages. The move caught nearly everyone off guard, including Tom Cruise himself. In a deposition the following year, he admitted he had been blindsided by the filing while he was working on a film in Iceland. The media, too, scrambled to explain the speed and secrecy of the decision. Headlines painted it as a shocking split, but those close to Holmes suggested it was the result of months of quiet planning, not a sudden change of heart. Speculation swirled almost immediately about Scientology's role in the breakup. Reports suggested that Holmes was deeply concerned about her daughter's future in the church, particularly given its well-documented programs for children of members. Former Scientologists had spoken publicly about the cadet system and the Sea Organization, sparking questions about what Holmes feared might lie ahead for Suri. While the church denied exerting control over her family, the timing of her departure and her swift legal maneuvering seemed to underline her determination to chart a different path. By the morning after the filing, the story was everywhere, splashed across front pages, dissected on morning shows, and debated endlessly online. For most people, it felt like a bombshell that appeared overnight. But for Holmes, it was the culmination of years of private doubts, months of planning, and ultimately, one decisive step toward protecting her daughter's future. Life inside the safe house. In the days immediately following the divorce filing, Holmes kept her world as small and private as possible. She and Suri stayed close to home in New York, avoiding the usual paparazzi haunts and keeping a low profile while the media frenzy raged outside. Neighbors and friends later remarked on how carefully Holmes managed her comings and goings, often moving quietly and without warning, determined to shield her daughter from the attention that seemed to grow by the hour. Food, routines, and entertainment were pared down to the essentials. Suri was only 6 at the time, and Holmes worked hard to keep her life feeling steady and familiar. Simple meals, storybooks, and the same cartoons that had always been part of her daily rhythm. For Katie, the focus was less on hiding in fear and more on creating a cocoon, a safe space where her daughter could feel as normal as possible during a moment when their lives were under an international spotlight. Security was a real concern, though, and Holmes was not naive about that. She reportedly consulted with advisors and took practical steps to ensure that she and her daughter were protected, especially in the chaotic period before the custody arrangements were finalized. But those who knew her during that time say she was remarkably calm, even under pressure, focused, organized, and unwavering in her priority, Suri. Years later, Holmes herself reflected on that period in an interview, describing it simply as intense. With quiet understatement, she acknowledged the strain of navigating sudden independence, constant attention, and the needs of a young child all at once. What might have looked from the outside like a dramatic escape was, in her own telling, a mother working day by day to keep things steady and safe, while slowly building a new life. The settlement no one saw coming. When the divorce papers were filed, many expected a long, messy legal fight. Cruise was one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood, and the Church of Scientology had a reputation for aggressively protecting its members. But Holmes and her legal team had a different strategy. They aimed for speed, privacy, and above all, protection for Suri. What followed surprised almost everyone. A settlement was reached in just 11 days. The agreement granted Holmes primary custody of her daughter, while Cruise received generous visitation rights. One of Holmes's stipulations was that Suri's day-to-day life remain private, and that her upbringing be free from direct church involvement. Cruise agreed to cover Suri's expenses, including education and health care, with reports at the time estimating about $400,000 a year in child support until she turned 18. Holmes declined any alimony, making it clear her priority wasn't money, it was independence. The Church of Scientology issued a short neutral statement, saying they respected the family's decision. Behind the scenes, however, former members suggested the church viewed the outcome as a major blow, given Holmes's successful effort to distance herself and her daughter so decisively. Holmes, for her part, didn't engage with the speculation. She focused instead on moving forward quietly, settling into a new rhythm of life in New York City. Years after her separation from Tom Cruise, there was a moment during a deposition in an entirely unrelated legal case when Cruise was asked directly whether Holmes had left him specifically to protect Suri from Scientology. At first, he seemed to push back, insisting that his religious beliefs weren't a threat to their daughter. But as the questioning continued, he admitted that Holmes had indeed been concerned about it. While this wasn't exactly a bombshell to those who had followed the story, it did seem to confirm what many people had long suspected, that Holmes's decision to leave had been motivated largely by a desire to prioritize her daughter's well-being above everything else. After the legal proceedings and media frenzy subsided, Holmes seemed to move through the world in a quieter, more understated way. She was often photographed in simple, unassuming outfits, her hair pulled back casually, navigating city streets without drawing too much attention. For someone who had spent years under the constant scrutiny of the international spotlight, this ability to blend in and just exist without commentary must have felt like a kind of freedom. It was more than just relief. It was a visible sign that she was gradually reclaiming her own life and identity, making choices for herself and her daughter, and doing so at her own pace. Quiet years, loud lessons. In the years after her divorce, Katie Holmes did something unusual for a Hollywood star. She stepped back, not with a press conference or a grand announcement, but quietly, in ways that made it clear she wanted her life, and her daughter's life, to feel normal again. She moved full-time to New York, enrolled Suri in a private school with strict rules about protecting students' privacy, and began building a day-to-day routine that looked far more ordinary than the one she had left behind. Instead of chasing big studio roles, Holmes leaned into smaller independent projects, including directing her own films. She was spotted taking the subway, walking to the grocery store, and doing the kinds of things most New Yorkers do without thinking twice. After years of being part of a high-profile couple, that sort of anonymity was a luxury. In one interview, she admitted simply that time was intense, explaining that raising a young child in the middle of a media storm had left her grateful for the relative protection that the city offered. Friends have said that Holmes began to live more intentionally, reminding herself daily that it was okay to set boundaries and to value the ordinary. Her style shifted too, less red carpet glamour, more jeans and sneakers, reflecting her focus on comfort and authenticity. She wanted to dress for herself, not for appearances. What stood out most, though, was her deliberate silence. When photographers called out questions about Tom Cruise or Scientology, she didn't lash out or explain. She just smiled, kept moving, and focused on her daughter. That choice wasn't about avoidance, it was about control. By saying less, she kept the focus where she wanted it, on her own work, her parenting, and the new life she was building. Over time, Holmes made New York her home in every sense. She took on directing and writing, experimented with cooking and baking, and kept her social circle small and trusted. Most of all, she raised Suri away from the spotlight, encouraging her independence and individuality. To Holmes, the true victory wasn't escaping Hollywood's glare. It was creating a life where the ordinary was something to be celebrated, not feared. She's been clear that she doesn't want that chapter of her life, as dramatic as it seemed from the outside, to define her. Instead, she's focused on what comes after, the steady, unglamorous work of carving out a sense of peace, privacy, and freedom for herself and her daughter. Why now? Why at 46? So why speak now, more than a decade after the storm? Katie explains it to a trusted friend over coffee in a quiet Soho cafe. Two reasons stand above the rest. The first is practical but profound. Suri turned 18 last April. For years, every decision Holmes made was with her daughter's legal vulnerability in mind. Custody agreements, non-disclosure clauses, visitation rules. All of it kept Katie cautious. But with adulthood, Suri is free. Free to make her own choices. Free to tell her own story. Free from the leverage that once kept her mother bound in silence. That single milestone shifts the ground beneath them both. The second reason is larger than just their family. Holmes realized that her silence, while protective, also had a cost. By stepping back, she kept her daughters safe, but she also left other women inside high-control groups unseen. Their struggles went unspoken, their pain unnamed. Looking at younger women now, Olivia, Chloe, Maya, she recognizes the same fear she once carried, the impossible choices between loyalty and freedom. She remembers how Leah Remini's decision to speak against Scientology years ago had landed like a flare in the darkness, proof that someone had made it out alive. Now, at 46, Holmes feels it is her turn to hold the torch. This is the age, she tells her friend, when you stop waiting for permission and give yourself the green light to live your truth. There is already speculation that she may sit down with Oprah. Offers are on the table, and with Suri grown, the timing makes sense. Whether or not she chooses that stage, Holmes is clear about one thing. Her story will no longer be hidden, and if telling it helps even one person see a way forward, then breaking her silence will have been worth it. What she wants you to know. Katie doesn't want pity. What she hopes for is recognition, an understanding that choosing freedom isn't always neat or easy. It can be messy, expensive, and profoundly lonely. Yet it can also be the single best decision a person ever makes. She wants people to see that control doesn't always come wrapped in a villain's cloak. More often, it wears a warm, comforting smile, a gentle voice saying, "Don't worry, darling, we know what's best for you." That's the kind of control that's hardest to recognize, because it feels safe, even loving. And she wants mothers everywhere to trust the instinct deep in their bones, the quiet, insistent whisper that something isn't right, even when the world tells them they're imagining it. That inner compass, she insists, is often the truest guide you'll ever have. Above all, she wants Suri to understand one lesson about bravery. It isn't about dramatic gestures for the cameras or making headlines with public declarations. Real courage, she hopes her daughter will see, looks much quieter. It's the courage it takes to leave a home while cradling a sleeping child, to take a step into the unknown, to protect what matters most, even if it means giving up everything else: fame, fortune, public admiration. True bravery, she knows, is choosing each other. Katie Holmes once played a girl who dreamed big from the creek, full of hope and innocence. Today, she's a woman who quietly orchestrated one of Hollywood's most remarkable exits. At 46, she isn't looking back with regret. She's looking around, at a daughter who laughs too loud, at scripts she writes and directs on her own terms, at a life that no one can dictate, route, or control. The fairy tale didn't end. It simply transformed into something more meaningful. Ordinary Tuesdays hold their own victories. A decision as simple as whether to add sprinkles to the ice cream becomes a small act of freedom. And if you listen closely on a busy New York street, amidst the sirens and chatter, you might catch her humming that lullaby about the silver boat. Only now she knows the boat was never out on the water. It was in her chest all along, waiting patiently for her to raise the sail. So, what do you think about this story? Let us know in the comments section. Also, if this story has rewired the way you see celebrity headlines, then please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who still thinks escape only happens in spy movies or on the silver screen.